The coastal towns of Maine have long been famous for their serene scenery. That was until an unusual storm hit, completely shattering the tranquility here. Howling winds mixed with torrential rain raged throughout the night. The next morning, the entire town was left in a sorry, disheveled state after the storm's devastation. Most of the town's houses were in a mess, with broken eaves and tree branches strewn across the roads. David is a painter. He lives here with his young son Billy and his wife. David's house was also not spared. The painter stood in front of his house, watching a large patch of fog rising from the nearby sea. At first, he thought it was just a natural phenomenon after the storm, and even thought the fog intertwined with the distant mountains and clear water looked like a painting with a profound artistic conception. However, what he didn't expect was that it was this beautiful scene that would bring about a huge change in his entire life. After the storm, the house was in a mess, and coupled with this unknown fog in front of him, though he didn't know if it was good or bad, the supplies at home were already running low. Despite feeling a trace of unease about that patch of fog, David still decided to take his young son Billy to the town's supermarket to buy supplies. But shortly after they drove off, the father and son witnessed an abnormal sight. The residents by the road were all avoiding the spreading fog, but a convoy of military vehicles drove straight into it. The spray kicked up by the wheels mixed with the fog, exuding an indescribable eeriness. When the two arrived at the supermarket, David habitually took out his phone to check the time, but the screen only showed a no signal message. He frowned and walked into the supermarket, and the sight before him made his heart skip a beat. The shelves were crowded with people frantically stocking up on supplies, their shopping carts piled high, and the long line at the checkout counter almost circled half the supermarket. Clearly, this sudden fog had already made the town's residents feel a strong sense of crisis, which was far more disturbing than he had imagined. While David was in a daze, 3 soldiers in military uniforms walked into the supermarket. Their expressions were not relaxed, and they were also pushing shopping carts, as if taking a break to buy supplies. Before David could think further, another black soldier wearing a white military cap rushed into the supermarket. He went straight to the 3 soldiers and gave them orders at a rapid pace. Emergency recall from leave. Report back to duty immediately. David then realized the 3 soldiers had also come to stock up on supplies during their leave. But before anyone could sort out the situation, after delivering the order, the black soldier walked quickly towards the supermarket entrance, seemingly eager to leave. The moment his figure disappeared outside the supermarket door, a shrill air raid siren cut through the town sky. The piercing sound instantly silenced everyone in the supermarket, and was immediately followed by a commotion that broke out one after another. People swarmed to the windows, stood on tiptoe to look outside at the fog-shrouded streets, their faces filled with panic. No one knew what was happening beyond the fog. Outside the supermarket, an old man covered in blood was running frantically on the road. While running, he shouted that there was something in the fog, and that someone had already been dragged away by whatever was in it. Even though people in the supermarket who knew him kept comforting him, it did nothing to ease his anxiety. He immediately shouted, urging everyone to close the supermarket doors right away, to keep the monsters outside at bay. But suddenly, a man ignored the old man's warning and rushed out immediately. Rather than staying here waiting to die, he chose to run towards his car, planning to drive away from here. But, after finally reaching his car door, he had just opened the door when it was already too late. The fog was already rushing towards him irresistibly, and immediately after, the man's scream was heard. With the man's fate as a warning, everyone in the supermarket realized that the old man's words might be true, and that there might really be something terrifying in the fog, so they hurried back into the supermarket and closed the doors. Before anyone could catch their breath, suddenly, a violent earthquake hit the supermarket. After the earthquake subsided, the supermarket became the only place in the town that had not been invaded by the fog. At this moment, a woman suddenly stepped forward and said she wanted to go home, because her children were still waiting for her at home, and she hoped someone could help her. Although everyone looked at her with eyes of sympathy or compassion, no one stepped forward to help. In the face of disaster, people are all selfish. Now, even protecting themselves was a problem, let alone helping others. Looking at the eyes of everyone in front of her, the woman clearly realized this too. As she walked resolutely towards the door, she cursed that everyone there would go to hell. Although the people in the supermarket didn't dare to help the woman, they also didn't want to watch her die, so they tried their best to stop her. But the woman ignored everyone's attempts to stop her and walked into the fog. The remaining people could only wait helplessly in the supermarket for rescue. Fortunately, the supplies in the supermarket were sufficient to meet their basic needs. His son Billy lay on David's lap, shivering from the cold in such extreme conditions, so David went to the warehouse at the back to find a blanket for his son, but the power in the warehouse suddenly went out. David could only hold up his phone to use its fade light. At this moment, a strange sound suddenly came from behind him, specifically, from the warehouse door. It sounded like some huge creature was beating against the door. David was so scared that he took off running. In his panic, he accidentally ran into several employees who were on their way to the warehouse to fix the electrical wiring. David told them about the sound he had just heard, but they clearly didn't believe him. One of the young sales clerks, in particular, was arrogant and opened the warehouse door, intending to go outside and see what the problem was. When the door opened, there was no monster outside. The young sales clerk immediately turned around, stood up, and was about to mock David, but at this moment, the three people in front of him suddenly changed their expressions. A huge tentacle suddenly shot out of the fog. The tentacle immediately coiled around the young sales clerk, who was the closest to the door. At the critical moment, David lunged forward and grabbed the upper half of the sales clerk's body. However, the tentacle was incredibly strong, and the suction cups on the tentacle stuck to the salesman's body. When it pulled, it even tore off pieces of his flesh. The other two men were so frightened that they froze in place. It was only after David shouted at them that they came to their senses. But obviously, even the combined strength of the three of them was no match for this huge creature. In the end, the sales clerk was still dragged into the fog, disappearing amid his screams of agony. David and the others had no time to grieve. They immediately closed the iron door and used an axe to chop off a piece of the monster's tentacle. Back in the supermarket, they told everyone there what had just happened, but no one believed that there were monsters in the fog. Only the store manager, half believing and half doubting, prepared to go to the warehouse to check it out. It was only after the store manager saw the severed piece of tentacle that he gradually believed what David and the others had said. They used a stick to prod the piece of tentacle, and to their surprise, the tentacle still had sensation. It wasn't completely dead yet, but it didn't make any other movements either. Instead, it melted into a puddle of black liquid right in front of everyone's eyes. Having seen this with their own eyes, the store manager immediately went back into the supermarket to inform everyone of how serious the situation was. They finally realized that a single layer of glass wouldn't be able to stop the monster's attacks, so they moved many heavy items, such as ladders, bags of rice, and bags of flour, in front of the glass to block it. But in such a doomsday predicament, what was more terrifying than the monsters was human nature. Faced with the current situation, everyone in the supermarket had their own thoughts. Gradually, three distinct viewpoints emerged among the people in the supermarket. First, there was the group led by David. They believed and accepted what was happening right in front of them, and actively sought ways to get out of their current predicament. Then there was the religious group led by Carmody. Carmody was a religious fanatic. She believed that everything happening now was God's punishment for humanity, and claimed that the end of the world was near. Only by sacrificing some people could they appease God's wrath. She also declared that she was God's chosen one, and that everyone must obey her. As for the town's lawyer, Brent, he believed that no monsters existed in the world. He thought the fog was either a natural disaster or a man-made catastrophe, and that the idea of God punishing people was impossible. The group led by Brent held very extreme views. They believed they shouldn't wait in place for rescue, and that the so-called monsters were all a lie. Brent gathered a group of people who believed his claims, and wanted to rush out to find help. Even though David tried his best to persuade them otherwise, Brent stubbornly stuck to his own beliefs. David had to compromise. He found a rope and tied it around Brent and his group. This way, it could serve both as a way to scout the path, and to ensure Brent's group's safety. If something unexpected happened, they could pull them back. In time, as Brent and his group moved forward slowly, the rope gradually grew shorter, but suddenly, the rope in David's hand went taut and lifted into the air. Even though most of the people in the supermarket rushed over to hold onto the rope and pull it tight, the rope still snapped under the struggle between the two forces. When David pulled the rope back, it was covered in blood. Even more terrifyingly, half of Brent's body was attached to it. At the sight of this, everyone was so shocked that they took a step back. Only Carmody seemed to have found proof for her claims. She slowly grabbed David and muttered under her breath, "This is punishment. This is God's punishment." Everyone stared at this eerie scene, and surprisingly, no one spoke up to refute her. Some people even began to believe in the so-called divine punishment theory. Carmody said that monsters did exist, but they weren't the monsters David was talking about. They were demons sent by God to punish everyone. Finally, night fell. The group began to relax a little, and some kept watch by leaning against the glass. Just as they let their guard down, prepared to rest, and planned to eat something to regain their strength, a bug suddenly slammed into the glass. This scared them so much that they jumped back from the glass immediately. David picked up a lamp to look closely, and then countless insects began slamming into the glass. Right after that, an even larger creature, one that couldn't even be called an insect, pounced on the insects on the window, but in doing so, it crashed into the window, creating a huge crack. Just then, David had a sudden idea. He realized that these insects might have been drawn by the light, so he told everyone to turn off the lights immediately. But in the chaos, two other electricians misheard what David had said. They had mistaken turn off the lights for turn on the lights. As the supermarket was filled with light, the creatures' attacks grew more and more intense. Finally, the glass couldn't withstand the attacks any longer, and a huge hole was smashed into it. Insects poured into the supermarket and pounced on the crowd. The insects attacked everyone in the supermarket without discrimination. No one who was touched by them survived. Meanwhile, larger creatures entered through the window, some attacking humans and others attacking the insects. But just then, an insect landed on Carmody. Just as everyone thought she was sure to die, she was muttering something under her breath. A strange scene unfolded. The insect left her body as if under some kind of control, thanks to everyone working together to drive the insects away. Fortunately, not many people were injured. In the end, people drove all the insects out of the supermarket. Although the supermarket was temporarily safe, this sudden incident left everyone in the supermarket filled with anxiety. They had no idea what they would face in the next moment. The fear of the unknown overwhelmed some people. Rather than waiting to be killed by such disgusting creatures, some people in the supermarket even chose to take their own lives. Someone in the supermarket committed suicide. Witnessing the tragic state of the people in the supermarket, the psychological pressure on everyone grew heavier and heavier. To boost everyone's morale, David decided to go to the pharmacy next door to get medicine to help the injured. However, David had another plan besides this. He had calculated earlier that the distance from the supermarket to where Brent was killed was 200 meters in total, while his own car was parked only 50 meters away from the supermarket. In terms of probability, there was a high chance they could reach David's car without being detected by the monsters. What had led David to this idea was exactly Carmody's behavior when the insects had attacked just now. Earlier, Carmody had already deluded a group of people with her religious claims. Although most people still had their own judgment and didn't believe what she said. After that incident, most people seemed to start believing Carmody's claims, thinking that she was indeed the so-called chosen one of God, which was why the insects had spared her. And Carmody continued to spread her rhetoric in the supermarket, insisting that some people must be sacrificed to appease God's anger. If things went on like this, David couldn't guarantee that the next person to be sacrificed wouldn't be himself or his son, so he decided to take a gamble. As soon as dawn broke, David and his group carefully walked through the fog and entered the pharmacy without incident. But the scene in the pharmacy was even more unforgettable for them. The ceiling was covered with spider webs, and inside those webs were numerous corpses. At this moment, one of them was suddenly dragged away by someone in the spider webs. To David and the others' surprise, there was actually a survivor in the webs, and that person was the black soldier who had appeared in the supermarket earlier. The black soldier was still alive. He was muttering to himself, saying, "It's all their fault." As soon as he finished saying this, his body suddenly began to twitch violently, and then he suddenly fell from the ceiling. Countless spiders crawled out of his body. Everyone immediately turned around and fled. But besides these small spiders, they realized that the pharmacy was also hiding many large spiders. The silk they spun could corrode human flesh. Just as the group finally reached the door, they found an even larger spider waiting for them. One of them suddenly took out a wooden stick and stabbed the large spider, allowing the group to escape. When they rushed back to the supermarket, only 5 people remained from the original team of 8. Carmody didn't seem surprised at all to see them return in such a disheveled state. Instead, she continued to spread her rhetoric, under the terror of death. It seemed that God was the only belief people could trust. As a result, more and more people began to listen to Carmody's religious proclamations. Even those who had just fought side by side with David began to worship Carmody. Only David and the remaining few remained unmoved. They kept thinking about the black soldier's words in the pharmacy. Who exactly was he referring to by them? Could it be the military? So they found the only soldier in the supermarket and pressed him to tell them what had really happened. Under everyone's questioning, the soldier finally told the truth. It turned out that this fog was caused by a military experiment. The military believed that there were unknown worlds beyond this one, so in order to explore resources, they had created a dimensional window. However, all of this was just hearsay. As a mere soldier, this was all he knew. After hearing this, Carmody began to proclaim that it was the military who had angered God. She insisted the soldier should be the first to be sacrificed, claiming this was the only way to earn God's forgiveness. By this point, everyone in the supermarket had lost their rationality and blindly obeyed Carmody. They beat the soldier, then lifted him up and threw him out of the window. No matter how the soldier begged, no one in the supermarket showed any mercy. David could only watch helplessly as the soldier was dragged away right before his eyes. With the first sacrifice having taken place, David knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had to act again. Compared to the terrifying unknown monsters outside, the most terrifying thing was the complex human nature inside the supermarket. So, while everyone was fast asleep at night, they prepared to take the food they had secretly stockpiled and escape. But they never expected Carmody to have already found out about their plan. She incited all her followers, claiming that David's actions were a betrayal of them. Just as everyone else in the supermarket was approaching them slowly with knives, a sudden gunshot stopped the chaos. It turned out that one of David's group had shot and hit Carmody. The followers who had been under her control suddenly regained their senses, and fled in all directions inside the supermarket. David took his son and the others and rushed out of the supermarket immediately. When they finally managed to run to the vicinity of David's car, a huge creature suddenly appeared, grabbed one of them, and killed him on the spot. David and the others didn't have time to hesitate. They quickly opened the car doors and got in. Regrettably, including David and his son, only 5 people made it to the car safely. The rest were either captured by monsters or killed by the spiders. The first thing David did after getting the car was drive back home. The first sight that met his eyes was his wife's body hanging there. For his son's sake, David had no time to grieve. He had to keep going to survive, so he hurried to drive on. But the further he drove, the more corpses and scenes of devastation David saw. In the fog, they caught a glimpse of a portion of an enormous monster. It was impossible to estimate just how big it was. After the monster left, David continued to drive slowly forward. The most desperate thing happened. The car ran out of gas. They were stranded on that road. They now faced 2 options: either wait to die in the car, or go outside and be devoured by monsters. Rather than letting monsters decide their fate, they chose to take it into their own hands. So the people in the car made a decision. They only had 1 pistol left, and they planned to use it to end their own lives. But fate played a cruel trick. The pistol only had 4 bullets. This meant 1 person would be left behind. To face this desperate situation alone, looking at his young son, David decided that he would be the one to stay. For gunshots rang out in succession. Only David was left in the car, letting out a desperate scream. David opened the car door and decided to get out, ready to face his final end. But he heard no sound of monsters. At this moment, a figure slowly emerged from the fog, but it wasn't the monster David had expected. It was a military rescue vehicle, and the vehicle was filled with survivors. Among them was the woman, who had insisted on going home to find her children at the very beginning. As the vehicles passed by, the fog gradually lifted. It turned out the military had found a way to deal with the monsters. In the end, David was the only one left alive from his group, but no one could say for sure whether the real David was dead or alive. In 2007, director Frank Darabont adapted Stephen King's novel of the same name into a film, Creating the Mist, a work that combines science fiction, horror, and explorations of human nature. With its suffocating ending and profound portrayal of human nature, this film has sparked discussions among fans for over a decade. The film tells the story of a mysterious fog that shrouds a town after a storm. David Drayton, a painter, takes his son and neighbors to a supermarket to buy supplies, only to become trapped there. Lethal monsters lurk within the fog, and the survivors must not only face external threats, but also deal with escalating internal conflicts and panic. The most remarkable aspect of The Mist is that it is not just a monster movie. It is a profound study of human psychology and group behavior. The enclosed supermarket becomes a microcosm of society, which quickly fragments under extreme pressure. Mrs. Carmody, a religious fanatic, exploits people's fear to gradually seize power. She claims the fog is God's punishment for humanity, and even demands the sacrifice of living people to appease God's wrath. How religion can evolve into extremism in the face of fear is the most chilling part of the film. In contrast, the protagonist David represents reason and humanitarian values, trying to make decisions based on evidence and rationality. The film uses the confrontation between these 2 forces to demonstrate the fragility of human nature under extreme circumstances. The ending of The Mist is regarded as one of the most shocking and despairing endings in the history of cinema. David leads a group of people in taking the risk of escaping from the supermarket. After going through countless hardships, the car runs out of fuel. Faced with the seemingly inevitable horrific death, he uses the only 4 bullets left to shoot his companions to death, including his own son, to spare them from being tormented by the monsters. When he is about to commit suicide, he finds there are no bullets left. But at this moment, the fog begins to lift, the military arrives and begins to eliminate the monsters. David realizes that he gave up hope too early and collapses in extreme agony. This anti-heroic ending is a bold subversion of traditional Hollywood storytelling, and is also the most thought-provoking part of the film. Although The Mist is a concept-driven and character-driven film, its technical execution also deserves praise. Director Darabont effectively uses a limited budget to create a sense of tension and fear. The fog itself is not only a plot device but also a powerful visual metaphor, representing the unknown and fear. Although the monster designs in the film are not numerous, their effect is remarkable, ranging from giant octopus-like tentacles, to mosquitoes with wings the size of pigeons, to the colossal behemoth-level monsters vaguely visible outside the supermarket. All have successfully created a supernatural horror atmosphere. The Mist is not just a horror story, but also a sharp metaphor for contemporary society. The fog can be seen as a symbol of unpredictable crises in life, whether they are natural disasters, economic collapses, or personal tragedies. The film explores how people cope with situations that are beyond their understanding and control. Project Arrow. In the film, where the military opens a dimensional portal, also implies the catastrophic consequences that may result from humanity's exploration of unknown territories, and expresses concerns about the lack of transparency and accountability in scientific and military experiments. The Mist ultimately raises a profound question about hope and despair. How long should we hold on in seemingly hopeless situations, and when is it reasonable to give up? The film doesn't provide a simple answer, but instead leaves it to the audience to reflect on. The reason this film has been discussed and highly regarded for so long is precisely because it dares to challenge the audience, refusing to offer simple solutions or comforting endings. It shows humanity's best and worst sides under extreme pressure, reminding us that the real horror may not come from external monsters, but from the fog within our own hearts. In our own lives, we may also encounter various forms of fog. This film encourages us to reflect. Who will we be when everything seems lost? Will we succumb to fear and irrationality, or maintain our dignity and compassion? The answer may lie within each of us.